Hi, and thanks very much for attending today's event. I'm going to talk about our latest paper from the Jimmy Reid Foundation on sports and culture in Scotland. By way of introduction, this builds on a lot of our previous work on building stronger communities, and we see sport and culture as being a key part of that. That's because sports and culture benefit individuals, communities, and the economy more broadly. As we highlight here, there's very clear evidential links toward between physical and mental well-being, both for sport and for culture. It also has an economic impact. Sport employs some 60,000 people in Scotland and contributes £2.5 billion to the Scottish economy. Similarly, for culture, around 200,000 people and nearly £3.5 billion worth of economic benefit. 82% of the population engage in some way in sport or culture, although I'll talk, there are very different levels of that. But despite this level of engagement, public investment has been falling, down 20%, and we spend the lowest amount on cultural services in Europe. I suppose the reason for doing the paper essentially is that we felt that this issue had been given minimal consideration in public policy. There are plans and strategies, but there's not a lot of public debate. So what the paper does is talk about what is the sport and culture provision in Scotland, why it matters, and then does some evaluation about what's actually happening, what progress has been made with the various plans, and then reaches some conclusion and recommendations. So firstly, there's quite a long chapter, which I won't go into a huge amount of detail on. You can read it and download the paper. But we talk about the scale of provision in Scotland. The key thing is that there are very few statutory requirements. Local authorities generally are obliged to provide sport and culture to what's called an adequate level, which has never been properly defined. And the few legal tests that have been tried have indicated that that's really just very basic provision indeed. There are also in Scotland, we have very complex governance structures. We have many plans on all aspects of physical and cultural activities. Some are a bit dated, admittedly, but nonetheless they exist. But you can see, for example, the chart I put there on sport governance, how complicated it is. Multiple ministers, multiple quangos, lots of people with a finger in the pie, but no real overall sense of direction. Councils fund about 90% of public sport funding. A lot of that has been outsourced to arm's length organisations known as ALEOs, which was essentially a tax dodging ploy some years ago, and there's unlikely to be new ones as that loophole has been plugged. And it hasn't delivered the much promised extra funding that charitable status brought it. What we've seen is reducing hours on facilities, cutting of staff, and actual physical closure of both sports and cultural facilities. And this is largely because non-statutory services tend to be cut first. As council budgets are constrained, you essentially find the statutes where there's a very clear duty, such as social work or education, that's actually continues, but it's the non-statutory stuff like sport and culture that gets cut. We also, on the capital side, have facilities in dire need of repair and replacement. In the report, we pick out swimming pools as an example. Very good report from the swimming governing bodies, pointing to the fact that some 200 swimming pools are going to need to be replaced, and there really isn't a plan to do that. There's a very similar picture for culture and heritage. Across the UK, some 40 libraries close annually, and Scotland is not exempt from that by any means. And for the workforce, there's a heavy reliance on volunteers, and that, of course, disadvantages certain areas. It tends to be more time and available in less disadvantaged areas for volunteer activity. And those who do work in the sector often suffer from precarious employment, 0 hours contracts, and the like. So why does this matter? Why do we care if there are any sports centres or other cultural activity? Well, firstly, physical activity is a key issue, a key health issue. It's one of the leading modifiable health factors, along with smoking and others. And it probably, the lack of physical activity has been measured as costing the NHS around £1.2 billion per year. 69% of adults and children meet the guideline activity, but that's been falling off, or at least it's not improving. But that drops very sharply when you look at deprived areas, down to about 50%. There are very similar issues in the cultural area, where again you find it's deprived areas that get the least resources and the least level of engagement. Stronger communities, essentially, if you look at the Scottish Government's social capital index, we see that almost all the outcomes, such as they are in the national outcome data, most of those are at least not improving, and in many cases falling. And again, it's worse in deprived areas. Look at cultural activity. I rather like the, now 60 years old since Jenny Lee produced the first article. She talked about a civilized community. The arts, serious, comic, light or demanding, must occupy a central place. Their enjoyment should not be regarded as something remote from everyday life. And that's very much the approach we take in the paper. Just picking out, as we did for sport, we picked out swimming. For culture, we pick out libraries, something very close to the heart of both Jimmy Reed and the foundation. 25% of children read for pleasure frequently, and the average adult reads only 3 books a year. So it's hardly surprising that we have real challenges around literacy in Scotland and the UK more broadly. So we've done the chapter evaluating, and the thing to be said is there are many strategies, and we list them all. All the government bodies produce a plan for physical activity, for cultural events, and so on and so forth. But all of them demonstrate producing a strategy is fine, but there's very limited progress in terms of action, or more importantly, the outcomes that those strategies are supposed to achieve. We argue, based on some very good research done at Stirling and other universities, about the need for targeted action on deprived communities. This would be the best value for the public pound. There's also, as one of the Scottish Parliament committees did a very detailed inquiry here, identifying a gender participation gap in physical activity that needs to be addressed. And this is also linked to access to the school estate. If you walk around many of the very fine sporting facilities, for example, that we have in our schools, they're very often grossly underused. And part of that, particularly in out of hours time, is because of the use of private finance initiative contracts in terms of school facilities. We also have a crumbling cultural infrastructure. And yet arts investment has been shown to have very great economic benefits. And there's a very good paper we reference in the report on the benefits of that type of investment to the economy. And again, in the workforce, the problem for the workforce is low pay, poor job security, and the need for better training and development. We again highlight some recommendations from some of the professional bodies involved in this. So if we look at recommendations, there are lots of detail that you can look at in terms of individual sports or individual arts. So what we've tried to do is pick some sort of 6 high-level, predominantly government-level recommendations, which we think would make a difference in terms of turning what are often very good strategies into action. So one of the things we've got about is creating a coordinating plan, which draws together these, but it's got to have measurable outcomes. Sort of things the Christie Commission talked about. It's all very well talking about what you'd like to do, about processes, but it's outcomes that matter. So that plan must clearly explain the role that sport and culture can play in improving physical and mental health the economy and building stronger communities. In other words, making essentially the public policy case for doing something more on sport and culture as distinct from other services. We'd also put the provision of sport and culture on a statutory basis with recognised standards of provision, something more than adequate, and develop statutory reporting standards both for national and local government. This would lead to a development of a long-term programme for the capital investment that we need to sustain and improve facilities and to ensure the better use of underused facilities such as the schools that I was talking about earlier. We'd also need to recognise that there's a need for revenue resources to achieve those outcomes. And it's very easy, people produce reports says, well, we just need more money. But we do highlight in the report and other work that the Jimmy Reid Foundation and our partners, for example, in the Tax Justice Network are talking about in terms of broadening the local tax base so that we give communities not just the resources but the power to strengthen social enterprise infrastructure such as sports and culture. A key element of all these strategies has to be reducing inequality. It has to be the heart of every plan to improve sports and culture by targeting investment and ensuring facilities are available to everybody in all of our communities. And finally, but very importantly, develop a workforce plan for the sector that ensures we're training the workforce for the future, creating career pathways, and importantly, embedding fair work conditionality at every level of public investment. Thanks very much for listening. I hope that that's helpful, and you can download the full report from the Jimmy Reid Foundation website. Thank you.